Any movement that celebrates its centenary with a woodcut depicting its hero bearing a giant quill clearly has, shall we say, some issues with masculinity. After all, quills are more than just loosely associated with masculinity, and there were 16th century spells for how to control your lover's man's feather, and it's clear what was meant by that. So it was no accident that a feather, a quill, was chosen to represent Luther, who was one of the most aggressive intellectual combatants of the age. And as he threatened none other than a leading Lutheran prince, the ruler of the territory of Hesse, Philip, "And I really would not like your grace to get into a quill fight with me." That's a quite extraordinary thing for a commoner to say to a ruler. It's often said that the Lutheran Reformation owed its success to the alliances that it made with German princes because they had the political power that you needed to implement the Reformation. Germany, of course, was a patchwork of tiny territorial units, tiny duchies, bigger princedoms, independent cities. And Luther insisted on obedience to secular authority, and Lutheranism has often been equated with political conformity and respect for authority. And indeed, it's been said that it created the culture of acquiescence that paved the way for Nazism. Luther's first biographer, Johannes Mathesius, went out of his way to contrast Luther with the preacher who, when he was asked, "Can princes be saved?" joked, "Only if they die in the cradle, because once they are big enough to sit on horseback, they ride straight to hell." Luther, Mathesius insisted, had nothing in common with these old papist clergy who liked nothing better than to give princes a verbal kicking. But such conclusions are difficult to square with the conspicuous rudeness with which Luther so often addressed powerful figures. Most theologians take on other theologians, but Luther attacked many German princes as well. Yet Luther's Reformation depended on the power of princes, for only the support of the ruler of the territory of Saxony, where Luther lived, and other princes like him, made it possible for the Reformation to be introduced. Luther's enthusiasm for this kind of polemic suggests that something more was going on. So what I want to do is explore Luther's tortuous relationship with secular authority, and I want to link that with ideas about the self and identity by arguing that what drove it were deep-seated dynamics centrally connected to masculinity. So Luther used his quill as a weapon from the very beginning of the Reformation when he attacked the selling of indulgences, which were intended to give the purchaser time off purgatory, or for their relatives. When he put up the 95 Theses on the door of the castle church in 1517, which is the day we commemorate, and he did too, as the start of the Reformation, at the same time he wrote a letter to the Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz enclosing the 95 Theses. And perhaps it was that, more than the posting of the Theses themselves, that made it absolutely certain that they could not just be brushed under the carpet. And the letter he wrote is extraordinarily abrasive. And he threatened the Archbishop in that letter that if he did not clean up the preaching of indulgences, then someone would be forced to write against him. From then on, Albrecht of Mainz became one of the figures Luther liked to attack. and he nicknamed him the Idol of Halle, mocking his famous relics collection, and he also called him the Bride of Halle. Halle was the HQ of his diocese. And so he was impugning his masculinity with no regard for his position as a leading celibate churchman and member of the leading noble house of Hohenzollern. There he is. And in 1525, Luther wrote an open letter calling on Albrecht, who was a known womanizer, to enter the married estate. Albrecht's liaison with his mistress was common knowledge, and he even had himself painted with an image of his beloved. There she is, and there he is, and you can see where the arrow is pointing. That's quite remarkable for an archbishop to have an image of his lover depicted as a saint. Anyhow, this time, in 1525, Luther went about things quite carefully. He sent a copy of the letter that was critical of the archbishop to his friend Johannes Rühl, asking that he check with Albrecht in person that Albrecht wasn't displeased by the letter. And only then was Luther happy for it to be circulated and even printed. And what's really amazing about this is that Luther himself was about to get married. And in the letter to Rühl, he says, if Albrecht should ask why Luther, who urged others to marry, would not do so himself, Rühl should tell him that Luther, quote, always feared that he was not capable enough for it. He was determined to marry nonetheless, even if it should be just an engaged marriage of Joseph. And by that, he's clearly worried that he will not be able to what is the word? That he won't be able to have sex with his wife. And there's something in the way he imagines himself prancing down the aisle in front of Albrecht. He talks about vorherzutrappen. And in the irony of the contrast between Albrecht, who is more than capable, and Luther, who wonders whether he is or not, that suggests that something very strange is going on and that there's a profound identification with, as well as antagonism to, this most famous opponent of the Reformation. So not content with attacking Albrecht, he soon attacked his brother Joachim, who was the ruler of Brandenburg. He did so by taking up the cudgels on behalf of Wolf Hornung, a minor nobleman whose wife had been seduced, or as Luther put it, robbed by Joachim. Admittedly, Luther wrote, Hornung had struck her a bit with a blunt knife out of marital enthusiasm. But the contract he had later signed agreeing to leave her alone, and which put her under Joachim's protection, was, Luther said, sealed with a bratwurst. That is, it was worthless. So eager was Luther to take on Joachim that he threatened to get stuck into the lining of the electoral hat so that your hair really stands on end. Luther was getting stuck into Joachim's potency here in a fight which was essentially over which one of them, Joachim or Hornung, owned a woman. So when Albrecht of Mainz was finally driven out of Halle in 1541, and his famous relics collection that was epitomised the Catholicism that Luther had rejected was all dispersed, Luther couldn't resist attacking the once mighty archbishop again. And what he did was to write a mock relics list for him. And all of the relics were strictly biblical. There were 2 feathers and an egg of the Holy Ghost, half a wing of St. Gabriel, the archangel, and a big heavy piece of the shout of the children of Israel that knocked down the walls of Jericho. Even better, the Archbishop had promised to bequeath a whole dram of his true pious heart and a whole ounce of his true tongue, all of which would offer complete indulgence from all sins committed up to that hour against payment of 1 gulden. And he published this piece anonymously, but when he was asked if he had written it, he replied that of course he had. This the preachers know, the university, the town, so that it is completely unhidden and not secret. Even the bride of Mainz himself must know it, because I made it so that it would be recognised. And whoever reads it and has ever seen my thoughts or quill will have to say, Das ist der Luther. That is Luther. It's hard to imagine a more forthright statement of the equation of writer, quill, and aggressive manhood. Albrecht was not the only man to be driven out of power by Luther's pen. The same fate befell Heinrich of Wolfenbüttel. Defeated by the forces of the Schmalkaldic League of the Protestants, he not only lost Goslar, which he'd attacked, but forfeited his dukedom as well. And he and his oldest son were even put in prison in Hesse. So much for supporting ordained authority, as Luther always claimed he did. Luther had already weighed in against Heinrich with his pamphlet against Hanswurst. There he is, and there's the pamphlet. Against Hanswurst of 1541, against Jack Sausage. And ostensibly, the polemic was about Heinrich's accusation that Luther had shown disrespect to his ruler, the Elector Johann Friedrich, nicknamed the Elector Jack Sausage. Heinrich was an irresistible target. When his liaison with one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, the 16-year-old Eva von Trott, threatened to become public knowledge, he pretended she had died, held a mock funeral for her, and put her away in one of his castles. Heinrich was also suspected of a series of arson attacks that were carried out on Protestant territories, including one which burnt the city of Einbeck to the ground. Even Luther's supporters felt that he was a bit extreme, some considering that there was too much insult from a main teacher of our holy gospel, and another one thought it contained too much satanic raging. And even Johannes Sleidan, the historian of Lutheranism, admitted that Luther's response was very harsh. Luther gets going early. He explains that he didn't invent the name Hanswurst, Jack Sausage. However, it is a word that he likes to use, especially in sermons against stupid idiots who want to be clever but who are not up to it. But be that as it may, Luther goes on, some people think that Duke Heinrich has called the Elector Hanswurst because by God's, that is, your enemy's, grace, he is strong, plump, and somewhat round. But think what you will, so make in your pants, hang it around your neck, then make a jelly of it and eat it like the vulgar sows and asses you are. That's pretty full-on invective. And the polemic is some of the most fun or full of energy that Luther wrote. By this point, Luther himself was, of course, if not strong, plump and somewhat round. And indeed, at about this time, the Cranach Workshop designed a frontispiece to Luther's Bible that was also used in Luther's collective works, and that shows a solid Luther balancing an equally solid Elector, two heavyweights on either side of a crucifix. So in these quill fights, Luther demonstrated all the swagger of male single combat in an age where male nobles had to prove honour with their bodies and jousting remained the favoured noble sport. This was, after all, the era of the codpiece. Authority was expressed through physical prowess, and you had to be willing to back your position with your fists. This was true not only of nobles. Luther had early acquired a physical version of manhood as he watched his father in the rough mining town of Mansfeld where he grew up, where fights were routine and where economic disaster threatened if your word wasn't respected. he also drew energy from intellectual combat. Luther's theology was developed in a series of disputations or staged arguments with other scholars that were held in public and followed careful rituals. He defended his views first in front of his order at Heidelberg, then at Leipzig in front of scholars from all over Germany, and tellingly, Luther arrived with a group of armed students. At Worms in 1521, the highlight of the Reformation, Luther stated his position before the emperor and the assembled estates of the empire, including many of the princes that he would later attack in print. He showed courage in doing so, and he ran the risk of being burnt for heresy. So Luther knew how to fight with the quill, developing a pitch of aggression that metaphorically put your body and masculinity on the line. One of the first of the figures that Luther attacked was Georg of Saxony, the cousin of his own ruler, Frederick the Wise. And Georg rules the other half of Saxony. So Georg had started out, there he is, and he'd started out critical of the Catholic Church like Luther, and he supported and made sure that the Leipzig debate happened in 1519, when Luther and Karlstadt took on the Catholic theologian Johannes Eck. But the debate seems to have convinced Georg that Luther was indeed a heretic, and he became a dangerous opponent of Luther's. And Luther certainly thinks that Georg is out to get him. And after his appearance at the Diet of Worms, the first letter that we know that he writes is to his friend, the painter Lucas Cranach. And in it he wrote that he would rather suffer death at the hands of tyrants, especially those of the furious Duke George of Saxony. But instead, he'd listen to the advice of others. So that's very interesting, because when he's realizing that he's got out of Worms alive, the person who he thinks was out to get him was Georg of Saxony. Luther was unable to resist any opportunity to attack Georg. And again, women are often the objects of the dispute. So in 1523, Luther had arranged for the nuns of Nimschen in the territory of Duke George to be hidden in herring barrels and brought to Wittenberg to get out of the convent. He housed the nuns, and of course eventually he married one of them, Katharina von Bora. So there's a wonderful way in which Luther stole his own bride from Georg of Saxony, because convent women were part of the patrimony of a territory, because they prayed for everyone in that territory. And Luther talked about how the wagon driver stole the women. And he termed the man who drove the wagon a robber, but a blessed one, like Christ robbing the souls from hell. Nor was Luther above referring to the women collectively as my brides. 2 years later, he was at it again, and this time seizing these spoils of Christ, as he put it, from another convent, again in Duke Georg's territory, and he gave one of his students permission to marry one of them, Gertrud von Mühlen. It's interesting, the wife that Luther chose, because von Bora was, of course, of the same social estate as Georg himself. Luther seems to be making a bid to be considered the equal of nobles. And what's also really funny is that he nicknames Georg the peasant, der Bauer. So it's like he's saying, I'm as good as a noble and you're just a peasant. And of course he understands himself as in some ways a peasant, because his grandfather was a peasant, even though he was actually the son of a mine owner. And it's also interesting that when Luther first tries out being a member of a secular estate, not being a monk anymore, he disguises himself as a nobleman. When he's, that's just the two territories of Saxony, so that you can see that one is ruled by Frederick the Wise and the other half is ruled by Duke Georg of Saxony. So the map kind of conveys this clinch in which the two princes are, and why this attack on Georg is so much part of Luther's identity. There he is again. So there's Katharina von Bora. And when Luther first becomes a layman, he disguises himself as a nobleman when he's hiding in the Wartburg. And interestingly, Luther didn't have many hobbies, but one hobby he did have was wood turning. And that's very interesting because that's a hobby that many nobles in the period had. And he was serious enough about it to order the best tools for wood turning from Nuremberg. So Luther and Georg get into this sort of clinch, and they publish vigorously against each other every couple of years. And that culminates in a really vicious tract, Wider den Meuchler zu Dresden. And this particular quill fight began after the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, and that's important because that's the moment at which the Lutheran Church, in a way, comes into being. It presents its confession of faith to the emperor. And Luther couldn't be there himself, and he'd published instead to his dear Germans. And it was an anti-Catholic tract, which Duke Georg then decided he was going to attack in turn. And then he does that also by contacting Luther's ruler and telling him to get Luther to tone things down. So how this works is Georg writes to Friedrich, says, stop Luther behaving like this. Then Friedrich and his official call Luther up, and they say, what have you done? Would you tone it down? And then Luther writes back and says, well, I've only done this. And then Frederick writes an anodyne reply to Duke Georg. And the person who's in the middle of all of this is this guy, Chancellor Georg Bruck. He's the Saxon Chancellor of Duke Frederick, Luther's ruler, who always has to be the intermediary and write these emollient replies. And then what happened is that since the electoral court, Luther's side, have done their duty, Luther goes ahead and publishes too, and Georg publishes an attack on Luther. And that's quite extraordinary, because to have a ruler publish an attack on Luther is really quite something, and it involves the ruler descending to Luther's level. But Luther was, of course, a much more experienced polemicist than Georg, and by the time Georg's pamphlet was on the market, Luther was already tipped off, he knew, and had his own reply on sale as well. So we've got here two antagonists of completely different social classes. So how do they negotiate the social distance to create a conversation? Well, Georg does so by half pretending that he didn't write the pamphlet, that somebody else did, the priest Franciscus Arnoldi, and he uses the third person throughout. He never addresses Luther directly, but he also never calls him doctor. He adopts a fairly measured tone, as befits a ruler, and he says that Luther is of the devil, but he doesn't have lots of passages of abuse. Luther does the opposite. He uses insults to create a level playing field. And first, he addresses the reader and refers to Georg in the third person. And then he starts slipping into the informal you as he begins to address his antagonist. Quite an extraordinary thing to do. And he makes fun of Georg for pretending that his tract was written by someone else, and a priest to boot. And the text of Georg's tract, he says, refers to the layman's view of religion. And he makes it clear that he knows who the layman is. And so he says, I'm going to beat the donkey in the sack. And if the donkey complains, then he'll say, I was only hitting the sack. So that Georg's failure to claim authorship licenses Luther to attack him without the respect that you owe a duke. While, even more fun, he can get away with insinuating that Georg is a donkey. The greatest insult is the title against the Meuchler of Dresden, that is the secret, cunning deceiver. And Luther never says who the Meuchler is, so he attacks Georg without naming him. But since he calls him of Dresden, everybody knew exactly who he meant. Even Luther knew that this went a bit far, and in his table talk in 1540, he admits, in choosing that title, I really was a rascal. So ironically, the quarrel raged over Georg's accusation that Luther preached disturbance, that he stirred up revolt and showed disrespect to established authority. And throughout, Luther says, absolutely untrue. Although, of course, the entire tract is designed to undermine the established authority of a ruler. He concludes by accusing Georg of slander and perjury, writing that if Georg can prove that the Lutherans are guilty of fomenting revolt, then I will consider you to be a man. But Georg, Luther says, is silent, and you run away all the time, spewing and dirtying the paper with unnecessary words, as if you've got this new art straight from heaven. You curse us as rebels, and you can't make it true and prove it. Do you know what such people are called in German lands? They're called desperate rascals, traitors and dishonourable ruffians who take the honour of innocent people with their poisonous gobs. This is your true name, be you who you will. So it's a wonderful passage. He turns all Georg's insults around. Georg had called him a causer of rebellion, but since that's not true, Georg must be a perjurer. And if you're a perjurer, then in this world where your word is incredibly important, if you don't keep your word, then you're not a man. And he's someone who can't keep control of his body. He's just voiding words all over the page. Well, Luther certainly won this round. He escaped being ticked off by the electoral Saxon court, and he published a much more vitriolic attack on Georg than Georg published on him. But he was sailing very close to the wind because Georg was related to his own ruler, and attacking his honour was an affront to the honour of the ruling house, the Wettin house. So he had to do some quick footwork. So he apologised on May the 8th to Chancellor Bruck for the fact that a copy had reached Georg in Dresden before it had reached Bruck in Torgau, but he didn't apologise for publishing, and he hadn't asked Bruck's permission to publish. But he got away with it. On July the 2nd, the Duke and the Elector met at Grimma and agreed a truce, including the condition that Luther ceased to polemicize against Georg. But it has this wonderful proviso, insofar as it is possible, and not against his conscience and the teaching. And all that Luther had to promise to do was not publish a second attack on Georg, which he was already threatening to do. So the two are at it again in 1533, this time with roles reversed, as Georg now calling Luther a perjured monk. And he calls him a perjured monk because he'd broken his monastic vows by marrying. This time, and there's Georg's piece, and there's Luther's reply. Luther manages to get in two replies, and he could laugh again at Georg about authorship, because this time he guesses that Georg hasn't actually written it himself. It was written by Luther's old enemy, Kochleus. And Kochleus has a most unfortunate name because it means snail. And Kochleus is always wandering around just behind Luther, always attacking him, and just a little bit late. And in the tract, Luther plays all kinds of games with Kochleus's names. He calls him old snot nose, he calls him spoon, all kinds of things that you can do with his name. And in the tract, interestingly, Luther also reflects on his own life as a monk and why monasticism was so dreadful, as if the whole engagement with Georg made him ponder his own identity and history. So, as this example shows, Luther's aggression repeatedly tested the bounds of political tolerance. And it's always the same thing. A ruler complains about Luther's behaviour to Luther's ruler. Luther's ruler gives Luther a light ticking off and reminds him that he owes obedience to the elector. And then Luther does all this angry posturing and insists on having it out with the opponent. So, interestingly, the themes are not about religious truth. They're about who is the man, whose word can be trusted. And that's a big theme of masculinity in the 16th century, where, of course, oaths were a major guarantor of social peace. So for all his supposed respect for authority, something more complex is at work in Luther's relationships with rulers. It looks as though Luther can't resist testing himself against princely rulers. And in 1534, Luther was again called to account by the elector for insulting his cousin Georg, and he says he's my cousin Georg, and he's also attacking my uncle Mainz and Magdeburg. So that again you can see the relationships and how important they are, because all these houses are interrelated. And Luther had done this after a sermon on All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day. Interesting. Duke Georg always knows what's going on. Someone is telling him. And Luther was once more written to by Chancellor Bruck. And Luther's reply to the elector was masterly, admonishing, and so he writes to his own ruler saying, I don't like to see you serving, that is, dienen, in this matter. That is, I don't like to see you acting as Duke Georg's lackey. So he's coming pretty close to insulting his own ruler. And his letter to Chancellor Bruck is wonderfully unbuttoned. It is true, he says, that I would like to get my hands on Duke Georg and the bishop, and this letter plays right into my hands. He had indeed preached against the Archbishop of Mainz, and the sermon would soon be on sale, he added, which is hardly going to make Bruck feel happier. After the sermon, Luther explained, he'd been sitting with one of the visiting rulers at table, so you can imagine the jugs of beer, and he'd said that the Archbishop was of the devil. He added that he intended to say prayers against the Archbishop of Mainz, which is quite extraordinary. It's praying against someone. That's what he said he was going to do. And he added that he might perhaps have said the same about the Duke too. But if he hadn't, I say it now, even if I have to defend it with my neck. And he concludes, friend, let them come in God's name. So he's positively courting a fight. I think praying against rulers and against the Archbishop of Mainz is a quite extraordinary bit of quasi-magical aggression in a society where you routinely prayed for rulers. Yet by this time, the old enmity with Georg had become something of a comfortable routine. And there's a wonderful passage in his pamphlet of 1533 where he imagines how the two of them might set aside their quarrel. Ah, my dear sir, let's just drink a little tankard of beer with each other, although you might be stronger and able to drink more little tankards than I in such a case. So I think that's very interesting, because Luther imagines him and his opponent sharing a drink together, and that wasn't the last time that that would happen. And then he concludes, I'm writing now with the Flaumfeder. That is, I'm being so soft that I'm writing not with a quill, but with down. So this is the non-phallic Luther, the man with the ticklish, soft pen. He was joking, of course. So by the time Georg died, Luther had almost made his peace with his old enemy, as if he somehow understood that he'd needed him. Passing his own obituary judgment on the Duke, he remarked that Duke Georg wanted to be neither a papist nor a Lutheran, but after the Lutherans had been suppressed, to be himself the man who reformed the church. And I think that's wonderful because it reveals how much Luther identified with Georg and competed with him, because if he credited himself with anything, it was being the man who reformed the church. And Martesius, delivering his biographical sermon about Luther long after he died, remembered Luther talking about the old Duke at table. Georg had asked Erasmus for advice, who'd given a particularly obscure and twisted answer, to which the infuriated Georg had replied, "Dear Erasmus, wash my fur and don't make it wet. I praise those of Wittenberg who don't put flour in their mouths, but come out freely and openly with their view." So in the memory of the Reformation, Georg had become an old buffer, an enemy to be sure, but also a forthright Saxon who shared their hatred of the overly subtle Erasmus. So now we can understand a bit what Luther was threatening when he warned Philip of Hesse that he would rather not have your grace get into a quill fight with me. And this happened in the aftermath of Philip committing bigamy. Unable to contain himself sexually, but aware that his adultery excluded him from communion, he asked Luther and the other reformers for advice. When they agreed that a secret second marriage would make his liaison with his lover legitimate, Philip secured their signatures on their memorial of advice. There's Chancellor Bruck, who's the guy who had to mediate between the two Saxon rulers. You can see he's aged somewhat under the strain. Here we have Philip of Hesse, and here we have wife 1 and wife 2. And Philip went ahead and married her in a semi-public wedding. An excited Philip had then written to Luther, addressing him as his brother-in-law, because they were now related through Luther's wife, Katharina von Bora. And Philip also sent him a huge consignment of wine as a present. And so this wagon of wine travelled all the way to Wittenberg, and of course people could see it, and they said, "Oh, I wonder why Philip of Hesse is giving Luther a present." So the matter soon became public, and Luther refused to support the Landgrave and admit that he had signed the memorial of advice, and said that he would just deny that he had ever suggested bigamy. Philip, however, had the winning card. He could publish the memorial with Luther's signature. And that's the point at which Luther makes his scarcely veiled threat, and Philip certainly knew what it meant. He replied at once that he did not want to get into a quill fight, a Federkampf, with Luther, nor to make your feather twitchy, because I well recognise your skill in this, and I am certainly not minded to get into a squabble with you. So the metaphor of the Federkampf and the active moving quill expresses that aggression between the two, with the socially superior man admitting to Luther's polemical power. And he underlines that by using I. He doesn't say we, which is what he normally would say. That's your normal mode of address. You always use the royal we. And the sexual overtones of the exchange aren't accidental either, because in the same letters, the Landgrave accuses you clerics of being allowed now to marry whomever you choose. And he reminds Luther that the princes had agreed not to treat their wives as whores and to recognise their children as legitimate. So, Luther, if you're allowed to get married and have legitimate children, why shouldn't I too? This is an extraordinary remark, and Philip's outrage conveys just how momentous the changes of the Reformation were, because a whole class of men who had never been expected or allowed to marry were now able to marry whomever they pleased. And few other social groups had that freedom, especially not the nobility. And it wasn't a freedom that the next generation of pastors would have, because increasingly they would find their brides from other pastors' families. As so often, Luther, having said, I'm going to fight, immediately follows this with, Philip of Hesse immediately follows this with an appeal to male bonding. And Philip says, how I wish that I could spend an hour with you. We'd soon come to an agreement. And again, it's drinking. It's the idea that have a drink together and we'll make it up as men. So that full-on aggression is also, I think, a kind of closeness. What was Luther's masculinity, and how did the Reformation transform what gender meant for men? As the last 30 years of research have made clear, the Reformation certainly accomplished huge changes in what the priest's manhood meant. It abolished celibacy, removed the clergy's immunity from taxation, made priests citizens, and in the new pastor it created a new model of masculinity. And you can read it all off Luther's hair. Up to there's the Saxon elector. Up to 1521, so this Luther here, you've got the tonsure. So that's the celibate Luther. Then, when he's in hiding in the Wartburg and pretending to be a nobleman, he suddenly sprouts hair. He's got hair all over his head, he's got a moustache, and he's got the whole works. It's just lots and lots of hair. And then he arrives at his mature look. And it's an interesting look because you can see that he's got hair, he hasn't got a tonsure, but he decides to be clean shaven, and he develops this little outfit here, which is the pastor's uniform. He's got the shapeless black clothes of an academic, and he's got a new uniform for the clergy. So Luther liked to posture as a father figure. He condemned Zwingli for becoming a soldier and getting himself killed on the battlefield at Kappel, and he insisted that priests should never be soldiers. And of course that's important because the pre-Reformation clergy had not been meant to carry weapons. But when students at Wittenberg smashed the windows of the town judge, so Mathesius tells us, Luther threatened from the pulpit, "If such a disturber of the peace came to my house, I'd step out and deal with him with my house spear and defend the peace of my house and my dwelling as a house father is legally entitled to do. If I stuck my spear into such a rebel, I would stand still and shout, 'Here, God's justice and the emperor's justice, before the two of them I declare self-defense.'" I find that quite extraordinary, just kind of right on house father, ready to skewer anybody who comes into his house. But Luther also understood the precariousness of masculinity. By 1545, his old enemy, Heinrich of Wolfenbüttel, and his eldest son had been defeated and imprisoned by Philip of Hesse and the Elector of Saxony. Luther writes against them and insists that Heinz repent his many sins, says he's guilty of miserliness and usury, but it's the ending that's particularly interesting. So have I run out of time, or can I give that?
You're okay.
I'm okay, good, right. So at the end of this pamphlet, Luther concludes with 2 psalms. And then he suddenly explains what the psalms means by the word schlaff. And he says, "It is when a man becomes cowardly, and his hands tremble, his legs shake, and his head hangs, so that he cannot hold spear or sword, much less fight or defend himself. He just stands there and lets himself be stabbed and hewn as if he were a block of wood. unable to move, a man's heart is taken away. Well, there wasn't any obvious need for Luther to supply a gloss on the meaning of this well-known word, but it does convey what had happened to Heinz, who had been unable to defend himself and had lost his lands. He'd lost his heart and his potency. For Luther, the heart was strongly connected with courage and the ability to resist, central to his persona since the posting of the 95 Theses. Becoming schlaff was something that Luther would himself understand only too well. As he aged, he himself became impotent, and in the last months of his life, he wrote to his wife, apologising for his incapacity. For all Luther's subordination of the Reformation to secular authority, he managed to create a kind of polemical equality that few religious figures would later attain. For all his bluster, Duke Georg did reply to Luther, and Luther set out to destroy the masculinity of his opponents, taking their women, impugning their honour, and attacking even his own ruler on occasion. In a violent and personalised world, it also helped establish Luther's own masculinity and created for him a powerful polemical role as a prophet who had the right to bewail the state of the nation and speak truths to power. It allowed Luther to irritate the court and poor Chancellor Bruck, and to posture as a man who cared nothing for courtly niceties. And it had a longer legacy too. As Robert von Friedeburg has recently argued, this style of rhetoric was picked up again a century later during the 30 Years' War, and it legitimated highly personal invective against rulers that broadsided any attempts to see them as divine. So Luther has often been viewed as the man who developed the theology of the two kingdoms, the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of Christ, and insisted that Christians must obey secular power. But far from sanctifying political authority, Friedeburg argues, Luther's rhetoric drove a wedge between the all-too-human princes and what would later be conceptualized as the state. In the 18th century, so he argues, princes gained legitimacy by presenting themselves as guardians of the state and not as identical with the state. That's a very ingenious argument, but I think that for the 16th century at least, it overstates the power of Luther's bluster. Luther had no political power in his own right, and he had no institutional church either that could act as a counterweight to a ruler's power. Luther could hold his own in a fight against Philip of Hesse or Georg of Saxony with his pen, but only because he was protected by the Saxon electors. There's a libidinal investment in this whole verbal jousting on Luther's part that suggests that there is an element of denial at work. Luther's fulminations couldn't hide the fact that his Reformation depended in the end on princely power and on the political fragmentation that allowed those colourful characters like Albrecht of Mainz, Johann of Brandenburg, or Philip of Hesse to introduce or to prevent religious change. The enigma remains, however, of why the princes put up with it. Why did Georg repeatedly let himself become embroiled in fights that he was only going to lose? Part of the answer lies in the complex machinations of the relations between Duke Georg and the Saxon electors, who were permanently in competition. And in the end, of course, it was the dukes who won over Luther's rulers, because they sided with the emperor after Luther's death, and they won the electoral titles and the lands. Part of the answer lies in the way that in that period, in a fragmented empire with dozens of princes and dukes, politics itself was very much about strutting your stuff and competitive masculinity. But why did the rulers allow Luther to strut on their stage? Luther was increasingly a cultural icon for electoral Saxony, and although they increasingly had to keep a watch on him, he was able to express an aggression they couldn't. The physical alignment of Luther in the Saxon house, I think, makes that point. Luther's quill fighting allowed him to create social equality with the princes by pressing against the limits of what was socially acceptable. And because the ruling houses were all interrelated, just about any attack on a German prince indirectly threatened the honour of the Saxon house. This aggression, of course, was also posturing. In reality, Luther was dependent on the elector, whose protection had saved his life at Worms when he might have been killed as a heretic, and whose ongoing support preserved him. It was the elector and his officials, in conjunction with the church, who carried out the Reformation in Saxony. To negotiate this dependence, Luther magnified his aggression, tested the boundaries, and sought to create a voice for himself as a prophet. But there was always more to this than simply adopting a prophetic role. Hypermasculinity was central to it, and wielding the phallic quill became Luther's polemical mode. Thanks.
Our respondent, Professor Gadi Algazi, is a colleague and a friend. He doesn't need a lot of introduction, so I will be fairly brief. Nevertheless, something has to be said for the benefit of those who are neither doctoral students nor captive audience. Gadi Algazi is a historian and a social activist. He is a professor of medieval history at the Department of History at Aviv University and associate research fellow at the International Research on the history of labor in its global context at Humboldt University Berlin. And he started his career as a bona fide medievalist, focusing on German peasants, and slowly wiggled his way out of both peasants and the Middle Ages by spending more and more time of his research hours on the early modern era. Currently, he's working on a book on the making of scholars' way of life between 1480 and 1630, which has very few medievals and even fewer peasants. Gadi, please.
Never enough. Thanks so much, Aviv, and thanks for a wonderful talk. What I'll try to do is just offer a few topics or problems. You might want to take up any of them, or they might just flow into the discussion. I mean, we've had something to eat in between, so we're completely transformed by now. So it's not, if it's not your words, it's the food that actually made a lot of difference. So it's among other things, what I like about the talk is your way of finding your way through the thicket of those texts and people and anecdotes, and coming up with a complex argument. There are, as you say in Luther's Biography, there are few people we know so much about, and at the same time, so few people about whom so much has been written. So as you move through the talk, I was trying actually to see how the whole actually fits into the argument. And my way of following it would be more or less like this, that in older terms, it's about Luther and the rulers, Luther's and political authority, because few of his rivals among theologians and humanists is mentioned. But then at a critical point in the introduction, you say there's more to it. Something more is at stake, both in terms of what's driving him and what is at stake in those arguments, in those quill fights, which brings up the issue of masculinity. And then you follow that specific model of masculinity, which is basically about combats, not about competition, as you have among scholars, but really a question of honor and combats, in order to see how Luther reformulates relationships vis-a-vis political rulers and creates a niche for himself, not just a niche, I mean a very important position, while actually risking the whole time being just thrown out of the classroom because of bad behavior, because these are a series of perhaps calculated, perhaps not so calculated infringements against rules of civility, of courtesy, If you are a scholar, there are things you wouldn't do, certainly not in German, in the vernacular. If you are a protege of one of the princes, there are things you wouldn't say if you want to be invited to the next dinner and enjoy some support. And it's both amazing as a story that he makes it, that he manages actually to navigate this terrain, but at the same time the terrain is transformed very much by his actions. And then in the very last part, you try to contextualize, I mean, to work against our fascination with his project, with his moves, and look at patronage, about the limitations, and in some ways, not deconstructing, but showing how much he's making it up as he goes along, and denying, or at least trying to set aside the kind of intimate dependence that fashions actually his possibilities by playing out hyper-masculinity. Now, four questions or issues that I was thinking about. One is about that form of male bonding through disputations and jousting. I mean, at the background, we can have the schoolmen jousting with each other. We have scholarly and scholastic disputations, and we have political fights and quite, a sizable research literature on political tracts of the late Middle Ages. At least the English one are in the vernacular. In the 100 years more, they're already moving to the vernacular. So there's a space being opened up. And the first question I was wondering about is what kind of a playing field. I think that was your metaphor. Not Luther himself, but something is happening in terms of the playing field, which has changed. It's not rule what you can and what you cannot do. And clearly some of the faux pas by Georg von Sachsen. I mean, we have a prime minister who writes on Facebook, but what Georg von Sachsen is doing is actually risking his neck by entering the terrain of the printing world and the pamphlets and the vernacular, and he has to learn that Luther is just better at this kind of games. So what kind of terrain is it, and how lasting it is? It seems so open in this specific junction in time, but I can hardly think about 17th century guys like Spangenberg or those terrible, even pietists, risking or actually moving within a sort of space, and I would like to call it an Habermasian, what have you, public space. It's a unique space that seems to be emerging. It's partly based, of course, on printing and about vernacular and the fact that you're talking theology, or at least pretend to talk theology. And theology is something everyone has something to say about, unlike our, well, perhaps I wouldn't know, unlike our world. But several people around 1600 saying this is the one thing everyone has an opinion about. Unlike astrology or astronomy or difficult subject, theology is about your life, it's about your salvation. So many people have an opinion.
There is the Franciscan tradition of attacking the Pope.
Precisely. So there is a question of precedence in terms of the literature of the tracts, of popular preachers actually entering the very same domain. But Luther seems to be using the framework of theological debate to do with politics. And that's the real innovation. It's not the old myth of Lutheranism and democracy or what have you, but it is a political innovation. And he seems to be risking at any moment that people will tell him it's very nice, but it's not even that you're not talking like a good priest or like an ex-monk. You're just a bloody politician in disguise. So he's really vulnerable to vicious counterattacks, and he's very good at attacking other people. So can we say something about the properties of this space? And specifically, I would like to know whether it's lasting, whether we are not simply talking about the heroic first moments before things actually solidify. And in that sense, he's a model, but he's an impossible model, because the space, the political and intellectual space is not there. The second question has to do with masculinity and sex. because most in your talk, it was very much about one element of the dominant model of masculinity, which is honor and striking your rivals and aggression. And then Luther has this other side. And his way of talking about sex is also very, very peculiar. And I was asking myself, how new is it? Universities had their discourse about sex, late medieval universities. What are the risks he is thinking about when he imagines himself as a house father, as head of a household? When he talks about being able to perform or not, is it so different from, say, a late medieval student and their puberty rights, or is it specific to having to perform regularly? That is, having to entering the terrain of a married household. That may bring you back to Augsburg, but I think it's very interesting. I was thinking about the moment when Georg Spalatin, his good friend and shy ally, is finally married. He's already over, I think he's 45, I don't remember. And Luther is writing him this amazing letter in which he congratulates him when he is just about to enjoy his Katrina, while I am enjoying my Katrina, imagining as if they're doing the same thing at the same time, clearly trying to embarrass poor Spalatin, imagining synchronous events without telegraph or any modern means of communication, and provoking Spalatin into imagining them in places that are exchangeable and are parallel, without actually saying, it's going to be all right, old chap, I know what you're, what's happening. So few people could write such text. So what is the source of precariousness in that in that aspect of masculinity? Is it the regularity? Is it the obligations? Is it about domesticity as incompatible with their image of male, very masculine sexuality? The third question is about different models of masculinity. I think a lot of the literature suffers from the assumption that it's more or less one and the same thing all over the place. And I think we find it difficult both to historicize and to look at it as compounded by not only by gender systems but by class. And I was wondering whether we can place Luther's model of masculinity in a spectrum, in a broader repertoire of different shades and models of masculinity. He's sometimes playing the noble, the young, a bit rowdy noble. He uses the elder folklore of earthly, powerful peasants and their jokes on the questionable masculinity of courtly circles. Is he also using elements of discussions about masculinity among scholars and humanists? I mean, Helmut Prof made, I think, some interesting remarks about questionable masculinity of people engaged in Italian philosophy and their proponents in the North. It is absolutely relevant for Luther's way of discarding his rivals and posing as himself. But on a more basic level, I was asking myself, how specific can we be in terms of class and social position when it comes to masculinity? Otherwise, we have a problem with such a complicated and rich literature on gender, and until now, relatively thin statements about the history of masculinity. And the fourth and last issue has to do with the topic of the seminar. It's about the self, whatever that means. But we do know, at least, let's do the big we. We do know something about context and contextualizing. That is about the need to see selves as something that has not simply to be invented, but recreated, maintained with the help of significant others. And I think this is partly your last point in the analysis, that is taking patronage and relations of power into the picture, and in some ways saying that Luther is into the business of denial. My question would be, who helps him? That is, who else, what are the crutches for maintaining that sort of precarious masculinity? I mean, we might end up focusing on one person and a huge male hero, and while analyzing his strategies, falling for the magic of describing discourse and strategies. And I was wondering whether we can be more specific about the others, other than his combative disposition, his writing skills, his inner demons, and his courage. Manhood is not an explanation, it's a huge problem. And it's a project. And can we go back to the micro worlds in which he's moving in order to see who's there to support him in difficult moments, in order to reproduce or actually enhance his project? And that, I think, would be not a bad question for us in other contexts as well, in which the discussion about the self leaves us with huge questions about social production of the self, without necessarily going for an overly socialized notion of the self. So we are moving still, I think, between opposite poles of the discussion. So thanks so much, Lyndal. And this is just an attempt to start off the discussion.
Thank you very much. They're wonderful comments. I'm least sure about the first question about to what extent this is an ongoing space. I think Robert von Friedeburg would argue that it is an ongoing space, and that this is why that Lutherans do manage to create a space for themselves which gives them a political role, and that this means that German political philosophy ends up being different. It's a really interesting argument. I'm not sure that it really works, because I don't think that in the long run Lutheranism does really manage to create a separate political voice for itself in the way that the Catholic Church did.
And even in the way that Calvinists would.
Yep. Yeah, so I think actually it's really important to understanding what's specific about Lutheranism, that in the end it does support political power, and I think that's just part of the tradition that you need to be open about. So that's the first one. On the second one, masculinity and sex, yes, I think that partly what's going on is that it is very difficult for men who've been raised with the expectation of celibacy and whose primary bonds are to each other, for that suddenly to be overturned and to then find themselves having to enter marriages where they will have to have sex and having to live with women. And I think that there's a considerable change in the character of the Reformation once that starts to happen, once those men cannot rely on the others being absolutely there for them without any distractions at all, when the claim that a friend has on you is not counterbalanced by the claim that a household has on you. And in that exchange with Spalatin, I think there are a number of things going on. So when Luther writes and says, I'm going to celebrate with my Katharina while you celebrate with yours.
Please, I'm sorry. Not everyone here is an early modernist. Please say a word about Spalatin.
Oh, Spalatin is a really interesting guy. He is the secretary and librarian and a whole host of other things to Frederick the Wise, Luther's ruler. And the thing about Spalatin is that all the letters that come to Frederick go via him. And so when Luther writes to the Elector, he writes in German. But when he writes to Spalatin, he writes in Latin. And then Spalatin conveys to the Elector what it is that Luther is been saying and doing, and it's Spalatin who devises the strategy, we think, that means that Luther is not executed, is never tried for heresy. So that friendship with Spalatin is what saves Luther's life. And in the first years of the Reformation, Luther writes way more letters to Spalatin than to anybody else. They're in constant contact with each other. And it's a very, very important friendship to them both. Spalatin says he wants to get married, and Luther says, oh, no, you shouldn't do that yet, because you should wait. So he makes Spalatin hold off marrying because he thinks he's got to work for Frederick the Wise, and he doesn't want him to leave his post. So first of all, he makes Spalatin wait, and then he goes ahead and marries, and then Frederick the Wise has just died, and then Spalatin is free to marry. So then Spalatin marries. But Luther writes this letter to explain that he is not going to go to Spalatin's wedding. It's extraordinary. I think it's a terrible thing to have done, to have not gone to your best friend's wedding. And the justification he gives is something that he often does. He doesn't say, I can't go. He says, Katarina says, you can't go because it's too dangerous. And time and again, he will ventriloquize her when he doesn't want to do something. So, and he says he can't go because he's busy refuting Erasmus, and he can't go because it's because of the Peasants' War, and it's too dangerous, he might be attacked. So the thing about celebrating with his Catherine is about, I think it's psychologically awful, because it's like saying, we are so close, we're doing exactly the same thing, but I'm much more important, so I'm only going to do it in my head, I'm not even going to come. And I think the other thing that's going on is that in the way a wedding is contracted, the way it's done in Saxony, you sleep with the bride first, and then the wedding happens. And I think that creates huge psychological pressures, because if the wedding is not consummated, it's not valid, and it can be dissolved. So I think the fact that it happens, that the ceremony happens after the sex, adds a very heavy weight to the whole thing. So Luther is kind of reassuring, or is it one-upmanship? Is he saying, look, I can do it? Because the one thing that we know about Spalatin is that he did not have any children for 6 years. And his mother-in-law lived with them, and they didn't get on. So I think there's a lot of complicated stuff going on there. And I think that the Reformers' virility is a huge subject, not just for them, but for their Catholic opponents. And so we have a play, more than one play, which is about the private lives of the Reformers, and they imagine everyone wanting to have sex with Luther, and in particular Spalatin's wife wants to have sex with Luther, because in the thing it says, you're only any good at kissing and cuddling, and I want more than that. So there's a way in which that was public knowledge, a lot of what was going on with the Reformers, and the Catholics are fascinated by this.
It's just Luther. But nobody
All
says
the
things like
Reformers.
that about Calvin, and nobody says things like
All
that
right.
about Heinrich Bullinger.
No. This is all about Wittenberg. And there's a way in which what is happening in Wittenberg and what all their sexual relations are is very much part of this Catholic imagination. But for it to have gotten out, there must have been a lot of gossip. And there's just little things in it. I mean, it just seems to be very accurate. There's one wonderful moment where somebody says, of course, I know exactly what Katharina von Bora looks like. Because, of course, there are all those pictures of her everywhere. I mean, she is a poster girl. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff at work. So I think it's not so much about domesticity and repeated sex, so much as about just virility itself, and whether or not it's going to be possible to consummate a wedding. I think that's part of what is at issue. Quite surprisingly, I must say, I did not expect that. And I don't at all understand what is going on with Albrecht of Mainz. I can only say that, I mean, I just find it quite amazing that when Luther is about to get married, he should think of writing to Albrecht of Mainz and say, come on, why don't you get married? I mean, why is he thinking of Albrecht of Mainz in this way at this point? I find it really bizarre. And again, I think it's very much just to do with physical capacity in a really extraordinary way. Then about masculinity, I'm not sure about masculinity as an analytic category, and I'm not sure whether it really works. I'm really not certain whether this lecture is worth doing in a way, whether the project is worthwhile, because I'm not sure how helpful masculinity is as a category. We don't use femininity as a category in the same way. I think you're absolutely right. Masculinity tends to be unchanging. Whatever period you look at, it's always in crisis. It's always being defended. And so there doesn't seem to be much historical that you can do with it. But the only thing I would say is that what Luther is doing does amount to a change in possible masculine roles. And if I think about what Luther is doing, I was thinking about this again in relation to some ideas that come from queer theory. If you think of what the Reformation is doing, I would say you could see it as insisting on a binary model of gender, insisting that there are men, and they're all like this, and there are women, and they're all like that. And so one of the things Luther is constantly doing is exaggerating sexual difference, exaggerating gender difference, at a time when in fact women were not sitting at home because of their big hips. They were involved in all kinds of labour, all kinds of positions within craft workshops, and they were part of the economy in a way that was recognised and understood. So I think what he does change is that you can see the model of the priest and the model of the monk as being different ways of being a man. And the priest is not meant to carry weapons. The tonsure is really important and makes you immediately visible. And obviously there are all kinds of things in some of these woodcuts that make you really wonder about the tonsure and what it means. So it's a big thing. And then when he chooses to disguise himself as a nobleman and to attack Duke Georg, he really is taking on a noble model of masculinity, and I think class is absolutely central to this, and it's all in the hair. It's just really interesting how visual and how vivid it is. It's all connected as well with anti-asceticism, but I'd really like to know what you think about masculinity. I'm still not sure that it is a helpful category or what it is that one would do with it. I mean, I can see, yes, in my period with the abolition of celibacy, you then do end up with with confessions that have different models of masculinity.